Okay, for people who are joining the live stream, we are talking about some post-version 12 Wolfram Language features, and this particular one has to do with creating web pages with multiple panels. And where are we at right now? So is this runnable?
No. That's kind of a design example that Eric Shu and I have been talking together. So one note is we did have a meeting last April about the panel language and decided to kind of cut off half of the project and focus on the WebItem aspect, mainly for exporting to HTML instead of trying to unify the two interfaces.
Well, I understand that, but I think
I just want to make sure we're starting from the
same place. We're starting from the same place. I mean, the issue is that we had hoped to be able to. Let's take a look at my notes here. Okay. This is horrifyingly old. This is from January of 2017. Okay, so what? So there's a client switched mechanism in the new version, right?
No, we haven't addressed.
Well, that's essential. That's without that, it doesn't make any sense. Without that, there's nothing there. I mean, I don't understand what this is then. This is
client switch and WebItem were like designed to give you like a way to translate CSS specifications. So it's just the styling.
Yeah, well, what the heck is this?
And HTML,
so what does this have to do with anything?
I think it's a way to write HTML.
But this is something completely different. This doesn't make any sense. This isn't what we were talking about. What we were talking about and what you had, Ricardo, can you bring back up your the thing that you had created previously that you were able to demo?
Need to search it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because that was what we were trying to finish. I don't know what we starting off on some completely different direction makes no sense.
The conclusion we came to is that a lot of the previous effort, while still usable, a lot of the design was still focused on the multi.
I don't care. This is irrelevant. This is not what we want to do. Where did this come from?
So in meetings about WebItem, effectively, we have been focusing on the problem of being able to create, basically export pages and CSS from the language.
Okay, but I don't really, I mean, this is amusing, but this is incredibly low level and not very useful.
Right. So this is part of the approach that Eric Shu and I have been talking about.
But so we've been. Okay, well, I think this approach doesn't make any sense. I mean, I'm sorry. I just don't think. I mean, yes, this is the. What's the difference between this and just using XML?
HTML is a little bit higher level and a little bit more user-friendly.
So this is then. Hold on. So you, I assume, know, and I assume Eric is on this call, right? Eric is here. Yes. Yep. And I assume you know in detail how our existing XML system works. Is that correct?
Not in full detail. I've used some of it, but I haven't.
Well, so does this follow the same design or not? Because if it doesn't, that again is completely crazy. Right? I mean, you've invented something else that's basically exactly like XML element, but it isn't XML element. Hey, right. Wait a minute.
This one. HTML has attributes third and the content second. XML has attributes second and the content third.
Sorry, say that again.
The second and third arguments are sort of switched.
That's stupid. Why? Was it just
because this is just my roughed in. I didn't.
No, I understand. But did you not know how XML element works?
I didn't look at the documentation.
Okay, so that's wrong. That's wrong. So what are you doing here? I mean, other than just providing something that is basically just like this?
Well, but I was thinking that HTML element would do some additional things, but the XML element probably doesn't handle like all of the styles and classes and stuff like that. So I was just thinking that we can build in additional functionality that basically you can write styles in camel case or whatever, and it will be able to interpret it and then spit out the correct inline styles or classes. and stuff.
You've made completely your own design. You've paid no attention to all the work we did previously. You paid no attention to XML element. You just made a new design. Is that correct?
Correct.
I think it's just a waste of time. I just don't believe in this at all.
Certainly, they can be brought into parity without too much effort.
Yeah, but why are you showing me something where you didn't do any homework on it?
So far,
you didn't
this
even
is
look
really
at XML element. I mean, you didn't even look at the thing that we already have that's almost identical to this. You apparently didn't look at the previous panel language design. Ricardo, did you get your demo ready?
Searching, I found out on old notebook, yes. And yeah, do you want me to share screen?
Well, why don't you just send it to me? Because I think you
Okay.
could.
Okay, then I will forward you the email.
So the approach I've been working, Eric and I have been going.
Have you read all this
design.
stuff as well from 2015?
I remember going through some of that last year when we were still talking about panel language. The approach here is more from a ground up with HTML element and WebItem to build things that will be useful for panel in the panel language direction, but have their own uses as well for users. So it can kind of be an incremental development and support things that people are already used to.
Rather not if you don't understand how it relates to the other design.
Yeah. The designs will absolutely need to be brought into parity. This is more of a conceptual.
Okay, so what is this doing other than just providing a symbolic version of angle bracket, tag, etc.?
That's primarily what HTML element is. Very straightforward. Supposed to be. A web developer would understand how to use it.
What are the template slot ideas? So that's something. How does the template get applied here?
So the concept of the web item is something like a named template of HTML elements. So in this case, what Eric is showing is if we had made a template for a blog post, for example, it would be a web item template would be nested HTML elements with template slots so that you could say template apply and put in your content, put in your links.
Wait. How can you say template apply? Because this is not a type that template apply deals with. Template apply deals with XML, but it doesn't deal with this. So you're
template apply works on any expression because when you do string template or XML template, it returns an expression. It parses it immediately, and it's just a tree. And then it's a tree of an expression with template slot, and then insertion function, combiner function are basically rendering.
So you're saying
template back to a string.
So you're saying that if I said this whole expression here, and you
do template apply,
example below.
It's basically replace all of template slot with context.
And so the two things we want to just convey with
wait. What does this generate? This generates a raw string here. How does it do that?
It would be able to export that.
I don't understand. How do you?
Well, you need a combiner function to do that. Not sure how this is implemented, but yeah.
So, I mean, does this run?
No.
I don't understand why it doesn't run. It looks trivial. Why isn't it just 3 lines of code or something? Did you write the 3 lines of code or not?
No. This is, again, a conceptual level sketch of a design.
Ricardo, did you send me the thing that you had before?
Yeah. Should I have an email? I should run on a recent build. If you run the initialization code and then you run that backtick packet template stuff, it should open a web page for you.
Wait a minute. Just let me get myself set up here. Okay, you're saying if I run which, this here?
No, that you already run it. Then regular examples, just run the first line, and a new browser window should pop up. Now I'm not sure on which screen, since you have a.
Yeah. It's okay. So something popped up right there.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Now what?
Well, that's you can run other code and see how it looks on a browser.
Okay. So then here. Okay. So this is now responsive.
Well, it's not using interface switch here, so everything is absolute there. But if you find examples with the interface switch, it should reside. Yes.
Okay, so let's say flexible layout. What is this?
Let's try that. Well, this is still fixed in a sense that it's not responsive. If you go down, there should be something with you see where it says automatic column wrap resides the browser, and so like the design here was that WebItem, the first argument is the content, is the actual payload, and the second argument is the size specification. Now the size specification can be absolute, and so you can say something like scaled, or you can have an absolute with quantity and stuff, pixel and whatever, or you can use interface switched.
Yeah,
and when you do it,
quite nice.
And when interface when the compiler sees interface switch, it compiles to CSS specification that uses media query in order to and so the whole code is static. It doesn't use JavaScript here. It's
I understand. It's purely using CSS.
Yeah.
Right. I think this is quite nice. Now, what's involved in simply finishing this? What is that to finish here?
The nesting of those expressions are quite complicated, and the implementation I was having was working quite nicely for a lot of cases, but I guess there are like some weird corner cases that needs to be cleaned and some testing. Other than that, like the design needed to be cleaned up. There was like some kind of Pinterest design, and
Okay, so now in this setup, if I wanted to embed one of our forms in here, how would I do that?
Well, the form were designed to be full page, and so you can embed a form object, and it will render somehow into the page. There was also design to create basically a dynamic page with a context. I don't know if it's in this notebook. If you go down, try to go down and.
Okay, so let's just understand what this was a way of deploying. I mean, the main point here was to be able to deploy a multi-panel interface with a symbolic specification, right?
Yes, the original design was more concerned about creating dashboards, and so it was more concerned about like you have like a page with 4 panels, and you can resize and.
So what is this one? This is some.
This is like some kind of blog layout where you have like a sidebar and another. Yeah.
And this was generated dynamically with a random word here. Yes. Yeah, yes. This was just generated. So it's generated with an HTTP response. Now, if I wanted, okay, so does read more do something? Okay, so it just had a hyperlink there. But now, what if I wanted something where, I mean, what if I wanted to, for example, embed a notebook on this page, either embed a form, so that we've got 3 technologies here that we're dealing with. We've got the raw HTML technology, which is what you're showing here with the CSS. We've got our forms technology, which is, again, raw. The forms have some JavaScript. Is that correct? Our forms
right.
Have some JavaScript.
Right.
And then the third
they work even without JavaScript, but yeah.
Okay. And the third technology we've got is our full cloud notebook technology.
That works only with JavaScript. Yeah.
Right. Which, thanks to Jan's new system, has a JavaScript embeddable version. Right? Is Jan on this call?
Yeah. We can embed cloud notebooks on the page with some JavaScript library.
So in other words,
that's great. Since when?
Since about a month ago.
Yep. And it doesn't work yet against the production cloud. It will need 150.
Okay. So, I didn't know that actually. Okay, but so then what would happen here is that you would be able to, in this layout, you will be able to put a notebook specification. And that notebook specification, I mean, you need a backing notebook in the cloud, presumably, but then that notebook would appear as just one of the items here, and it would be resizable and everything. Is that correct?
Right. So right now you need an actual cloud notebook. So you need to specify a URL, and you can configure it the way you want, but you can make it so that it's responsive and just fills up whatever size you give it in CSS.
Okay. So then within that notebook, I put my mouse inside that notebook, I type something in, I press Shift Enter, things will happen inside that notebook, correct?
Well, no. Unfortunately, that doesn't work yet. It's using the deployed view essentially. So
I see.
You can read it obviously, and you can interact with stuff. There's no editing and no evaluating cells.
And does it
but is that
scroll? Is it a scrolling object too, or no?
That depends a bit. If you give it infinite height, then it will just use whatever it needs. Otherwise, it will introduce a scroll bar. Yep.
So in other words, you specify it's either a fixed height or it will just insert itself with whatever height it needs.
Yeah.
Okay. But do you think that in the future you can make those embeddable notebooks be editable?
It's certainly conceivable. It needs some bigger changes to our security model. Basically, there's some concerns. Okay. We basically need a kernel sandbox that's neither tied to the owner of the notebook nor the viewer.
Okay. Why aren't you just tying it to some UUID that's generated on that browser instance?
We could maybe work around things in some way like that, yeah.
Okay, but let's come back to the forms stuff, okay? So it is, I assume, Ricardo, straightforward to insert one of our forms in your system. Is that true?
I don't know the implementation. I guess it is. Yeah.
What?
Why not? I guess it should be straightforward. I mean, if it's just JavaScript and...
well, you wrote the forms stuff, so you know.
Forms. Sorry, I was thinking about notebooks. Forms are already supported, yes.
Okay, so can you show me an example which has forms? Maybe this one does.
Oh yeah, no, that was just showing.
So this is your re-implementation of that site, is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, I don't think I have anything here with a form inside. I should something.
How did you do that click to? How did you do the click thing?
Which one?
I mean, how did you do the drag? Is this operable? This thing here?
No, it's not. It's fake.
So what will be involved to make it operable?
Well, that implementation was using custom JavaScript, so you write your own JavaScript there. In top level language, there is no implementation to do something like this, I guess.
Okay, all right. So let's sketch. Okay, so then the thing that I've never understood is if you have 3 forms on a page, what is the control flow?
Well, for that, there are several ways you can think about it. One way that we are thinking is that basically you just replace the form with the content, or you display the content underneath each form. It really depends. I mean,
right, or you could go to a completely separate page, or that form.
Exactly. Yeah, because
Right.
for example, if it is a search form, you want to go on a separate page.
Okay, but you think those are the two cases, that either you are using the form to generate something like a form page, which is, there's like an embedded form page versus a form function which would go to a separate page. Is that kind of the thought? Because
most of the time, one page gets one form and yes, return a response. And then there are other forms, but they are kind of independent. They redirect to other pages like search form and stuff like that. Yes, I think most of the time.
Okay. All right. So, another question here. So right now, like if I take this notebook just for fun and I say publish to cloud, okay, I should get, if I publish it here, I should get a notebook. There we go. Let's go to an anonymous window here. And I should get, if everything works correctly, I should get a version of that notebook in the cloud. Okay, which is, so someone was asking on the live stream, transforming a notebook into a dynamic website. I mean, that's kind of what this is doing. And presumably I can just, well, this is a published notebook, but this is kind of ugly. Why does it look, maybe you just, oh, it was ugly originally. It's ugly now. Okay. Fair enough. So, and if I wanted, yes. So now the other technology that we have had is the Transmogrify technology for generating things like documentation pages, where there is no expectation that anything will be active, right? And where we're just using click to copy, but where we have the advantage that it's pure HTML. I mean, what has happened with the, what does this look like to an HTML only? If I switched off, how do I see this as a pure text? How would I see this in like a purely textual view without JavaScript and so on? Is there an easy way to do that? Somebody?
You can see the HTML source, but that's not what you want, I guess.
That is not useful. That's in fact really bad. I mean, where is the thing that like a search engine could find? Where is that? Where is the actual material from that? The actual text?
If you have
so you want to see the page with JavaScript disabled.
Yeah, there's a browser plugin that you could probably install that removes all of CSS and JavaScript.
Okay, but why am I not seeing in the HTML source? Why am I not seeing somewhere the actual content?
You would be if you search for it. At least the first part of it.
Just not very human readable, I think, is your complaint, Stephen. And Transmogrify does give us more human readable HTML output.
I mean, if we go, for example, to let's see, if we just go to the documentation, some random.
But the content of the notebook, Jan, is in the HTML or is it part of the JavaScript?
Well, you won't see the full notebook content in either of them. So there's what you get initially with initial HTML is the first few cells as HTML. The rest is loaded on demand. Both JSON data to render it in a live way, and HTML for cells below the fold.
Okay, so
and obviously we don't make any effort to line wrap things nicely and indent stuff. In fact, we deliberately choose not to do that.
So your assertion is that if I were to use our web crawl functionality and try and extract things from these pages, that I would be able to extract reasonable stuff from both of these pages. Like that page there, if I do, for example, let's just try it. If I do and that page, if I do import of that page, oops, not the view source part, import that page, comma, now what would I want to say? I'd say want to say HTML, for example. Is that going to be total mess?
That will give you some garbage as well.
That's not bad at all. That's really not bad at all. I mean, that's perfectly...
Content is in there. There's also some other stuff, and this will also improve, like this menu. You see the menu of the cell gear, the items in the cell gear menu, basically. That will actually go away.
Okay.
Right on the page. But yeah, the content is basically there for most cells. So basically, it takes the first few cells and always includes them, and then pure textual cells will also be there.
Why aren't you
code cells? Yep, you got it.
Well, I'm not sure that's the right decision, but okay. But let's look at this one by comparison. Oops. Okay.
Steven, if you take a look at the notebook, at the end of the page, it was like a tentative design for adding metadata, like for search engine and stuff. That was the web page wrapper, where basically, you know, you can have you wrap the content that can be like, you know, a notebook and stuff, and add like custom external script or meta tags that can be understood by search engines.
Right. Okay. Okay. By the way, there are some comments on this live stream, which I think it's interesting to respond to. Somebody's talking about panels on the desktop. That's a horrendously hard problem because you can't run browser type technology on the desktop with the security models that exist. Why don't we release the HTML JavaScript thing that we use in Cloud Notebooks? I'm not quite sure what that means because the whole thing is tied into servers. I don't think there's a thing. I mean, the JavaScript embedding mechanism is, I think maybe what Nicola is asking for here is actually what we're currently calling the Wolfram application server, which is something you can install somewhere that will provide a, well, no, because that doesn't support notebooks. That doesn't support notebooks, right?
No, it doesn't.
It supports, say, APIs.
I think one thing we can say is that the library to embed Cloud Notebooks on other pages, that will be released. So it will be basically a thin wrapper that's even going to be open source. And it's going to be on NPM and so on. But it will, basically what it will take is a URL to a cloud object, and then it will render that notebook on your website.
Right. So Ethan here is saying, generating HTML is easy. The real problem is there's no built-in way to parse raw HTML. It's interesting. What parse, as in parse it into something which can then be manipulated, I assume. So in other words, to do the analog of XML import, right? So if I import this page and I import it, what happens if I do that? I mean, if I import that page, it's probably a fairly large page, but let me try importing that page as XML. What will it do?
Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. The problem is that when you import as XML, XML is supposed to be, you know, perfectly nested. And the way people are writing HTML is not. And the way browser understands their automatically closing tags and stuff, probably we can have like some kind of sloppy XML import that is what probably the browser is doing with some automatic close and of what is not closing to.
So your claim is that the reason that this is failing is because it's not correct XML. Is that right?
Yeah, most of the time this is what is happening. People are writing,
browsers have always been very forgiving, right? And
correct.
And efforts to make HTML, XML, perfect have never really carried through that much.
So this is
Yeah, there was the whole XHTML stuff that no one wanted to do.
Right, it's just more work all the time.
So Ethan here is talking about JSoup and appears to have a JSoup link. Sounds interesting. Which is doing what? It's then importing something. So this is a kind of a forgiving HTML importer of some kind. That's what I'm understanding.
Yeah, that will be useful. I guess that when you're doing import HTML hyperlink or other elements, it is forgiving because there is already some logic that is, parsing the HTML in a way that, like the browser is doing.
What is HTML DOM? Is that I don't recall that being one of our. I mean, this is that would be. No, we don't have this. This is something new and different. Ah, okay, all right. Now we've got a GitHub link to JSoup link. Cool. Okay. All right. This is great. This is the best possible thing. As if we're yeah. Okay. This looks like a bit more. But we obviously should look at this. This looks like a very interesting thing. And look at this HTML elements. This is cool. Wow. Very nice. That's the easiest way to do development, is that other people do it for us. That's wonderful.
I was also thinking, like, if
what is this? This is wonderful. Okay, go ahead.
No, I was saying, like, I was thinking like that when you do import XML element is not really human readable, and it would be nice, like, if you go down, like, there is like this tree explorer, and maybe we should do something like this in the notebook as well. When you
this seems to be exactly that. Opens an interface with that as the root. Well, okay. This is very interesting. So what this is doing then is it's using an external importer and turning this into something which has this HTML element mechanism. Well, that's really interesting. So the point being made is that there's yet another constraint here. Okay, so let's zoom out for a moment to what we're looking at here. So on the one hand, if we could construct some pretty raw HTML and just say, okay, put it out as a page, right? And we're doing that in a way that is more tree structured, more explicitly tree structured, not just a big blob of text. It's not completely obvious to me that people will be that excited about that, because if, the thing we've got with XML template allows you to write raw HTML with just random, string inclusions for the for templating. I mean, I'm not sure why this is an advantage relative to just having. I mean, if people are just going to write raw HTML, I just don't know whether. Okay, that's one. Yeah, go ahead.
I also foresee, so one of the tacks for taking Wolfram Language generated content in cells is to do something like a rewrite of Transmogrify, so it can turn cell structures into HTML element structures. And I think that having HTML element as an in-between lets the developer here, if they have, if they're savvy in HTML, they can do customization in language before they do exports. So having that as kind of like an in-between level where, web developers can really roll up their sleeves, even if they don't, get all the way there with Wolfram Language. It's kind of a way for web developers to be able to use this tool right away.
Right, but okay. By the way, D8 on our live stream says XML template is pretty good, though the documentation is really bad. Who wrote the documentation for it? What is the
Well, that I guess it was me. Unfortunately for XML template, probably we can use some of the new pattern we're doing for documentation, because there are like slot and nodes like that have a particular syntax, and it's true that it's hard to find them inside the documentation. And there is like the XML if or the for loop or a switch. And it's true that with this scheme of the documentation is too much information in a single page, and we should probably split it.
Right.
Not sure
so
how.
okay. So workflows are the obvious thing. That
One of them, but it sounds like tech notes here would be useful too. Pseudo tutorials.
Right. Okay. But so what XML template does is it takes what is essentially a textual lump of HTML with included, and it would be good if you showed an example of that here, by the way. I mean, a slightly bigger piece of HTML.
The problem here is that you don't really write it like this. Most of the time, I mean, this was the problem when I was writing the documentation. That most of the time you want to write like those things in a file directly, and like you have a directory of files with HTML inside, and using those tags, and then you do just file template or XML template of file, and then the path to load it. But you don't really write it directly in the notebook, which is why
does this describe XML template of file? Does this? Yeah. Here we go. Yeah.
Right.
String. Right.
And I think the way you want to use it most of the time is to use XML template of file, and then with a file textual editor, just edit the HTML file.
Sure. Right. No, that was the obvious thing to do, and that should be described as a tech note or a workflow. I would have thought a workflow would be a perfectly reasonable thing. But in any case, okay. But so the problem this is solving is just review what's happening here. So here you've got a textually written out piece of HTML with little inclusions that say how things should be, templated in, so to speak, right? Yes, makes sense. Now, what this is doing is taking, this is providing a symbolic expression structured version of what would otherwise be the purely textual XML that's being specified in XML template. Is that right?
That's how it looks to me. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we have the XML object, XML element thing where you can lay it out structurally, but
right.
I don't think it gets much.
Well, do we? I mean, so does XML template work with? No, we don't need to use XML template if you're using XML element,
right?
Because that's just a pure template apply. Okay.
You can embed XML element inside this thing, and it will compile them into XML.
Okay, so Ethan on our live stream is making the comment that XML XHTML is not isomorphic to HTML, and is making the case for a separate treatment of HTML separate from the XML stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, it sounds like there are two potential reasons for that. Not the least of them being that actual HTML in the wild isn't XML compliant. Is that a true statement?
That's certainly true.
Wild, yes, but sure, go on.
Sure. It depends a bit which direction you want to go. If you want to parse existing HTML, then you certainly can't treat it as XML. Not even fully. It's not whether it's standard compliant or not. This HTML standard is not compatible with XML in all regards. So to parse it, you certainly need to treat it specially. But to generate it, I think it might be fine. You might get away with having symbolic XML and then generating XML out of it. That's still valid HTML.
Okay, but I mean, we specifically didn't have a function called HTML template because we actually thought about this issue. So the source for, let's just walk through, how do you make a web page? Basically, that's what we're talking about here. So let's look at the various different ways you can make a web page. Okay, so one thing you can do is export a notebook to the cloud. That's one way to make a web page, right? Which I think, which can then be embedded. I mean, this is basically how to make a web page. Okay, and then this, which can then be embedded through the JavaScript embedder. What are we calling that JavaScript embedding thing? Jan?
The Wolfram Notebook embedder.
Okay, all right, so that first item is export a notebook to the cloud. Okay, so another one would be potentially export an expression as HTML. And that's using the existing HTML export, right?
Yes.
And we don't really...
Like HTML fragment is usually more useful, and it's limited.
Okay, but so this is using the existing exporter. Okay, the next thing we can do is use XML template to inject material into, into an existing HTML, and we're a bit confused about HTML versus XML structure. Is that correct? That's a less fancy thing. So now we've got on offer. Then we've got Ricardo's. Almost seems like some kind of well, anyway. Ricardo's WebItem symbolic description.
You forgot the trademark there.
Next to Ricardo's. Well, I was thinking it was like a restaurant name. Let's see. WebItem symbolic description of the page, right? And which, because of the notebook embedder, we could take essentially Chrome. This is a way of providing, can provide essentially Chrome around an embedded notebook or multiple embedded notebooks. Is that correct?
Yep. And one thing I want to clarify is that the JavaScript library, the Wolfram Notebook embedder, really just runs on the client side and embeds the notebook by constructing DOM elements and injecting them into the page and so on. If you want to serve static HTML as part of the page for the notebook, then you need some additional mechanism.
I don't understand that. Is that embedded HTML that you're talking about there, or what do you? But this requires, okay, so this solution requires a background cloud. So it could be a public cloud, it could be a private cloud running in AWS, it could be all kinds of things like that. But it requires a Wolfram cloud in the background. It's not a standalone thing, and nothing that's truly interactive can be standalone here.
Right.
I mean, not until or unless we have WebAssembly and all those kinds of fancy things happening. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we've got this WebItem symbolic description, and then we've now got this new. We've now got the HTML. Now this is Eric's HTML element symbolic description, which is a lower level symbolic description. Is that a fair statement? I mean, I don't quite understand.
I think the main difference is Ricardo's is focused on generating CSS and Eric's is focused on generating HTML.
Well, it's Ricardo's not pure CSS. It's CSS with HTML in it, isn't it?
Right. But I don't know. Maybe it's just the examples he showed, but they all had pretty simple examples, and then the CSS was impressive. It seemed, all of the cool stuff I saw seemed like the effort was into, translating.
Well, fine. But I mean, this isn't doing CSS. This is doing pure HTML. Is that
yes, true? Eric? Yes, Eric's thing here is focused on and authoring HTML in the symbolic expression.
Although there's certainly room for including CSS.
Right.
No, but that's a whole separate thing, because look, to me, what you're doing here is providing, and I don't really understand the advantage of it, you're providing a tree-structured version of a file, an HTML file.
Well, I was just thinking that this is one representation. We could use a file, like if you wanted to write an entire HTML file with slots to put stuff in, you could.
Yeah, but why is that any different from what XML template is already doing?
Well, because they're not the same thing.
But why not? I mean, other than the okay, but that's because of the difference in the structure of XML and HTML. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then, okay, things to make potentially. Potentially one thing to make is HTML element. HTML template. Okay.
I think
analog of XML template.
The way Eric and I are using WebItem is as an HTML template, but it's a named template.
Yeah, so the idea behind it was that if we're designing a web page with very common styles, let's say a blog post, it was kind of the example here, is that WebItem would be templates of individual pieces of the site that that some author would be able to go and just plop in and replace all the content. All the styles would be defined. You would just be able to plop in these named objects and then just change the content.
I don't understand. What is this? Okay, so this thing here is essentially
this one first example is kind of the wrapper around the whole web page. So that's just template you can apply.
Is this defining blog template or is this using blog template?
This is defining blog template.
That's totally weird.
That part of the design is something we want to discuss in more depth.
Yeah, but that's completely weird. Okay, so
it would need some sort of registration.
You're saying okay, so hold on. So you're saying there's a something you might want is a library of or repository of
obviously I've got repository on my mind for these things.
Right, repository of useful HTML templates. Right, that would be a thing that one could make. In which case, the way this would look is, it would say, just like interestingly, just like we have resource data, we could potentially have, I don't know whether this makes sense, quite resource template or whatever, and it would be something like template apply of resource template, comma, and then some set of the parameters that you wanted to put in there, right?
Yeah,
something along those lines.
Okay.
I already know the namespace conflicts are going to be a nightmare on this one, but
but
that's the idea.
Okay, so then the concept of an HTML element here. So then there's another thing, which is importing of HTML, for which we have that very beautiful GitHub
JSoup.
Well, that wasn't the name of the actual okay, so importing of HTML to a symbolic representation. So what one would presumably want, and I'm a little confused by that. I mean, that had an HTML element, but I don't understand how deep it goes. And in other words, is the whole DOM.
From the example, it looked like you could take an HTML element and then grab all the children. It looked like, so it's kind of like an entire structure.
Okay, great.
You can drill down.
So that is so then the HTML element, and I wonder how that relates to what we're doing with web execute. Okay, so questions. Relation to web execute and the way it handles the DOM. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so just to let's see, the proper thing to do is turn HTML, and I'm reading from our live stream comments here. from D8. The proper thing to do is to turn HTML into DOM, which is what we saw earlier with JSoup. Yes, that makes sense. Although turning it into an opaque, I mean, that was turning it into what appeared to be an opaque DOM. That is, for which you could go and explore different pieces, as opposed to something which is an unrolled symbolic expression here. Does that make sense to people? Right, because I mean, this here is just saying, one could imagine, instead of this, and I'm going to take a screenshot of this nice thing, instead of this, one could imagine something which unrolls this thing into a symbolic structure that looks like this. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, so the question there is, should it unroll into a full symbolic structure or leave opaque blobs effectively?
I mean, that might just be a formatting question, right?
No, I don't think so, because I think these DOM blobs, well, I don't know if that's a formatting question. I don't know whether it's unraveled to symbolic form all the way down, and that might be undesirable for all kinds of reasons. So
right.
It seems like there are, okay, so to summarize here, there are 3 representations, okay? So representations of a web page, of HTML/web pages. Okay, so one representation is, plain text of the HTML plus whatever it contains, plus inclusions. Okay, the next would be symbolic DOM objects, like this. The next would be symbolic HTML element tree. And the next would be WebItem like symbolic elements. Is that a fair statement? That's sort of a hierarchy of different forms there. Am I right? Am I wrong?
What's the difference between DOM objects and the HTML element tree?
Because in this one, I'm thinking that these are opaque objects of the kind that, for example, WebExecute would return. That you don't necessarily, this isn't immediately a thing where you can go and use, position or something on it. So I'm saying, does that make sense, Jan? Okay, so look.
Don't really understand it, but
no, it's important that you understand it. It's really important you understand it. Okay, so the question is, when this is brought into the language, right? If I go WebExecute, and if I run WebExecute, I have to remember how to do this. But if I run WebExecute, and I say something like, if I do this, okay, then the thing I get back, web session objects, for example. These things are what someplace here I should get a web element. Yeah, this thing here, right? See that? A web element object. That is opaque. Do you get what I'm saying?
Okay, I think I understand now. So it's handles that you can use other APIs on, but they're not expressions that contain everything.
Exactly. Whereas here we've got something that's fully unrolled, and we could reconstruct. We just pick up the content of the notebook, and we can reconstruct the web page. Whereas here you pick up the content of the notebook, and the thing might have gone. Who knows where it is?
Yep. Got it. That makes sense.
Okay. So
it's tied to a browser then, I think.
I don't know whether it's tied to a browser. Yeah. I'm not sure. Could be tied to a browser, or could be local data, but just not in symbolic form. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I'd like to know what this thing on GitHub does. But you get what I'm saying? Because it might be the case that this thing is something opaque to our language, where you can't run position on it, for example, and see something inside it.
Yeah.
Okay. Or it might be either because it's not local, or because it's just a handle, or because it's simply opaque. Right? Because, for example, if what this contained underneath was essentially a text file, you wouldn't be able to run position looking for a symbolic HTML element in there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's also creating a front end using something like React and a pile of APIs. Well, I believe that creating a front end using React is exactly what we just spent years doing under Jan's leadership here. Let's see, converting.
That's what we're doing for notebooks, at least. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is referring to, defining something using HTML elements, but also in combination with JavaScript.
I see.
Right,
Okay.
like if you wanted a click to copy tool that you could wrap around an HTML element or a WebItem, right? That might be done in JavaScript, and it would be one of these.
Yeah, so the idea is like, yeah, there was an auto copy WebItem template I had in the example. That's basically what would be from the blog, but of course you would have to have the JavaScript that would back that functionality. But at least you have the template to be able to put in the auto copy.
Right, and that's React has components, is what they call them, in there for things like that, from what I understand.
Okay, well, so wait a minute. D8 is saying converting HTML is useful, but it would be way more useful if it included CSS and JavaScript with it. Something like React components would be super nice. So I think you mean converting to HTML. And Mohammed says, please do something about the notebook history GUI. Actually, I just was looking at that yesterday, and we're about to have some programmatic ways to access the history that will be in the function repository soon. Okay, maybe HTML element is a poor name, since what you're wanting to do is turn a string of HTML into a symbolic representation of a DOM tree, and then to turn the DOM tree back to HTML. Yeah, well, right. I mean, these are low-level raw HTML elements, whereas one could imagine here, this is called HTML element, and maybe this should be instead called, I don't know whether HTML DOM element or something. I'm not sure whether that. I don't fully understand that. Okay, let's zoom out again for a second. Okay, so okay. Let's look at what we have and what we want to get. So first we have Ricardo's WebItem stuff, which really seems like it's a pretty good idea. I don't see a reason why we wouldn't finish building that. I mean, does anybody think that that's a bad direction for some reason?
I think my main criticism for either using Ricardo's stuff or Jan's stuff is that there's little room for someone who knows the HTML to come in and...
Okay, that's a different issue. That's a different issue, because you're asking if they want to write raw HTML, how do they do it? How do they merge raw HTML with one of these things? Is that right?
Right. If they know HTML, then they
okay. So the answer
learn
is
new
Jan.
things.
No. The answer is Jan just provided an answer to that for notebooks, right? It's a fairly complicated thing to embed, but he's provided an embedding mechanism. Now, we don't have that embedding mechanism, for example, for our forms, do we? Like something from a form function. How do you embed that in an HTML page?
We have embedded HTML and he's using an iframe.
No, but I mean, if I say embed code of a form function, I don't think it will work.
It would give you an iframe.
Does it?
It'll give you an iframe, yeah.
It deploys it to the cloud and then gives you an iframe.
Right.
Deploys, yes, automatically. And
okay, so one of the issues is what's on top, HTML or our stuff? So in other words, actually, so kind of layering is the issue. So one model would be, HTML is on top, and you've written most of your page in it. You just want to embed some active content. That's one case. The other case is WL content is on top. You want to embed raw HTML. plus, etc. in it. Is that a fair assessment that there are those two cases?
Right. The second case is what we have embedded HTML for, right?
That is indeed, that embedded HTML contributes to that. Okay, so this case here, HTML is on top. That's essentially Yarn's. Well, it's the Wolfram Notebook embedder is one. By the way, we probably should put that in the spell checking dictionary if we're really going to use that. So that's one case for this. The other case for this is the templating mechanisms, XML template, etc. Is that correct? Because then you're effectively writing the HTML and embedding through a template there. So, for example, one thing we might want to do is to have XML template interoperate with Yarn's notebook embedder. In other words, so that the combiner function of XML template, if you give it a notebook, does the notebook embedding. Did that make sense?
Yep. We need to decide what the head is, basically. If you put a cloud object there, should it always assume it's going to be a notebook, or maybe have some other?
Right, but so that's actually an interesting action item that we want to be able to take. We want to be able to get the text of an HTML-like page, but actually put, insert a notebook on it. And in fact, we don't have. Yeah. Okay. But that's okay. That's okay. All right. Now so the statement being made, oh, you know how to write HTML, so we want to make it easy for you to do stuff. Explain. Which of these are you talking about there? Eric, could you please explain what you were thinking of?
So explain which part? Sorry.
The part that I was just asking about.
I'd say it's probably the first one.
This one here.
You can, you can write an HTML template and you want to, take a notebook, generate a graph or a chart, one time, not dynamic, and have a way to embed that into the HTML that you've already written into that structure.
Right. So really, this is not what you want. You just want, I don't want all this junk. I'm just writing my HTML in a text editor or something, or some other, HTML writing system. And all I want is to be able to take the content from us and embed it. So part of this is simply getting the embed code stuff. I mean, that's really straightforward stuff. It's just embed code to make an iframe, and you just stick that, in your HTML. You just know what that embed code is, and you put it in your HTML, right? That solves that problem, doesn't it?
If you want to use an iframe, which makes sense for some things.
Right, but so we've got now the two cases. This embed code, which primarily goes to an iframe.
The exporter already works for images and PNG and stuff. All the static content. You need the iframe if you have interactivity, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying just pure export goes to things like JPEG and so on, right?
This
is a hierarchy. So we've got, if it's just a static JPEG, everybody knows how to deal with that. It lives in a location in the cloud. Well, you export. So this would be something like a cloud export. Gives you a URL for the JPEG that you can then stick into your HTML, into the HTML you write, and you're happy, right? This case is slightly more complicated. It's an iframe that would give you embed code for, and that embed code could be for manipulate. Can it be for a form? Can it be for a form function?
Can be. Yeah.
Sure. It would be iframed.
Okay, but is that the right thing to do for a form function?
Maybe not always, but certainly sometimes.
Okay, so that remains a question then. How to embed a form function output?
There's also in between those things. There's where you want to export static content for stuff where we still need to make it work, like say tab view. You don't want to iframe it because web has tab views, right? So converting Wolfram language, whether it's front end stuff.
Okay, all right. So this is okay. So there's an additional case you say, which is converting UI elements, WL UI elements, e.g. tab view, to native HTML.
Or just formats, traditional form text and things like that, right? Even if it's not UI.
Yeah. I don't understand that. That's HTML export.
Yeah.
Right.
Or HTML
all of these are just expansions on HTML export that are.
Well, but that's just the limitation of HTML export.
Yes.
Okay, but HTML export is fundamentally going to give you. I don't even understand what it gives you. Does it give you it gives you a directory of stuff, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, which is actually not particularly convenient, and you might very well want HTML export to export to the cloud because you just want a bunch of URLs.
Right.
I mean, this is where our products have been using Andy's Transmogrify.
Right.
For a lot of things because it, digs through things and finds the best.
Okay, well, so let's talk about that for a second. What about HTML export, creating URLs in the cloud? Okay, let's talk about Transmogrify for a minute. Okay, so Transmogrify we use for our documentation builds, and that's and what does it do? I mean, it's probably a giant hack tower built over a quarter of a century by now. Andre, can you comment on that?
I would express it somewhat similarly to what was being said about the HTML element thing, which is, to give somebody who has more expertise with HTML or CSS the means to use Wolfram Language to get stuff done.
Okay, can you show us Transmogrify in action? Can somebody show us this?
I'm not prepared to do that, but Andy could, or maybe if Bob has it on his.
Bob, do you have something?
No, it would take me 15 minutes to get something.
Okay, can somebody try and reach out to Andy, see if he can come and join us?
I'm here. I don't have it's going to take a while to do that, but
I mean, we're talking about a build process, and
I can describe to you what it does. Though it takes notebook or cell structures and it crawls through them and finds parts that are easily exported to HTML and finds.
Okay, so let's look at a documentation page as an example. Okay.
And when something needs to be rasterized, it puts it in a dedicated image folder, and then it creates HTML that points to that image.
Okay, but it
allows you to find custom CSS. It allows you to find custom mappings from.
Okay, but hold on. So
it's more like
page,
more like rule sets, right? You have a left-hand side, which would be a head of cell, and then a right-hand side, which would be XML element of.
What's the right-hand side? Is that what you're generating as output?
Yes.
Okay, so what it's doing. So let's talk about this is how to make a web page. So there's another is Transmogrify. From the very name, we already know.
Yes.
I mean, it was named advisedly, so to speak.
Trademark.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So its fundamental thing is take a sequence of cells. Is that a fair statement? And make quotes optimal HTML from them. Is that right?
Sure. It takes one structure and turns it into another structure based on rules that you create.
But I mean, is it doing it from a sequence of cells, or is it doing it from
notebook, head notebook, head cell, head cell group?
Right.
So each one of those. So there's a function Transmogrify which can take a single cell and do something with it.
Yes.
So, for example, if I look at this document here, so for example, I could pull up the source for this.
It's like cell style notes, maybe.
So, I mean, this is already pretty complicated here. So you've got code that somehow transmogrifies this into that.
Yes. It's recursive, so it starts and then dives down.
But the key point is there's flexibility in the rules to optimize the conversion for how we write our HTML.
Show us some of those rules. I mean, so I'm sure that there's a lot of very specific stuff in there. Like, for example, if we go down here, I mean, I've no idea whether some of these outputs, like output line 9 there, well, I don't know whether it is line 9. It isn't even line 9. It's rerun itself, right? Or did it rerun, or did it just generate these itself?
It renumbers itself on the fly.
Okay, so that's another little, featurette there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here, for example, this is probably pure HTML. No, it's not. It's
an image. Yeah.
Okay.
The outputs are all images.
Okay.
Because we use copy to clipboard. Yeah.
For the inputs, why aren't we doing copy to clipboard for the outputs?
We could.
Why don't we? Seems like a good idea to me.
Or copy to clipboard with the option of adding the output.
No. That's not what I want. If I go over the output, why doesn't it just offer me a copy to clipboard? It's not doing anything else for me here.
All right. Well, I'm just saying if you want both.
No, why would you?
Shouldn't have to copy twice.
I don't think
that's all
necessary. That's its own different thing. I think you'll want the outputs for different reasons than you want the inputs. Okay, so what this is doing, to be clear, is it's taking a notebook and it is making pure HTML with JavaScript and other funky stuff in it. But it's doing a lot of transformations here, right?
Right.
And it's creating these custom things like these openers, which are probably some special piece of JavaScript, right? And it's making the decision to put that there with a number 16 there, and so on and so on and so on. So there's tons of stuff here.
Right.
Okay. Well, so there's metadata for each of the notebooks that gets run through to help inform any of that stuff. Yeah.
But what is the user level version of this that we can imagine being useful? I mean, I think, obviously for what we're trying to do going forward for repositories and documentation and sort of user level docu tools, we're going to need something like this. But why aren't we so what is the trade-off between taking this as a cloud notebook? Do I dare to do the obvious thing here? I am going to do it. I want to see what happens. This is
the main trade-off is you don't need a cloud to back the result of this.
It's static, yeah.
By the way, this should have some kind of
progress indicator.
Yes, progress indicator. How did you read my mind for that?
I don't know, 25 years. No.
Okay, well, it did.
The question mark is whether the style sheet will be there. If it's not,
what just happened? That was a big weirdness. Okay, I closed that notebook before I'd copied out. Well, I guess I can go to my cloud account and go to, where do I go? In Cloud Files, and then I would go to Published, right? This one here. And then I would go to, how do I sort it? How do I sort the
top right corner? It's sorted alphabetically.
No, but sort by date created I want. There we go. Why did it come up with that sidebar? Oh, because I'm in the product view.
And it looks like the style sheet is not there, I guess.
Right.
Right.
Okay, but this stuff is not super embarrassing here.
It's also the authoring notebook, though, Jan. So that's kind of what it looks like. So.
Right. I mean, this is far from embarrassing, what we've got out here. We don't have click to copy because that's not what this does, right? Well, maybe if I'd looked at the deployed view, right? This is a user view, an owner view.
It is, but I think you still wouldn't see it for the inputs because you can, nicely select them.
Yes, by the way,
Reset
there's a bug for you, whatever that is.
Yep,
It's a
I'll
matrix plot.
take a look at that.
But now here, I see that's just a bitmap. Why is that? Maybe that was a bitmap in the source. Probably was.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Whereas now, what do you know? It's all active. Right. Right. So, I mean, this is not embarrassing. And the trade-off here, you know, if I look at the scrolling of this, it's not terrible. Right. I mean, you know, so the question is, can we use, well, why is that? Why is it not present? Why is the stuff, as I scroll backwards, why does it have any cross-hatching, Jan?
Well, there is this trade-off between putting everything into the DOM or not, and we decide to not put everything on the page, you know, plus minus from the current viewport. So there is this short asynchronous step where we put things into the DOM again as you scroll for the sake of...
Okay, so look, the trade-off is between this and a completely transmogrified thing that has somehow converted to the closest raw HTML, right? Because
yeah,
and what is the difference between the cached version in the isomorphic React cache of this page and the raw HTML, which something like Transmogrify might generate?
So first of all, the way we generate the cache right now and what you would get by default is that it only contains a few cells, as we discussed before. There will be a way to generate an HTML cache for the whole page for all cells, if that's what you want.
Okay, what's the relationship between the HTML cache and the HTML export output? And
then, I mean, it's just the way it's generated, basically, that the HTML cache uses our JavaScript front end to produce HTML. And so, you know,
yeah, but can I just pick up that HTML and go take it somewhere else? Or is it deeply entangled with a bunch of JavaScript libraries?
The HTML isn't really tied to JavaScript libraries, no, but it will use some URLs that are tied to the cloud for style sheets and for things like graphics that we factor out into separate files.
Okay, but so let's walk through this because this is really interesting. Okay, so what you're telling me is that the technology we've built with great effort. So we've got two technologies. We've got HTML export, which is very old technology that directly just generates HTML, but it has many limitations, right? Now we've got the modern system for making active cloud notebooks, which also as a side effect is generating HTML. But that HTML is pointing off, in some cases, to some either active elements or just separately stored elements. Just like HTML export has to make a whole folder of assets, right? You're saying this thing has trailing assets that are off in the cloud. Well, so do any of these things. So HTML export has trailing assets that are off in some other folder, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my question now is, if I look at the HTML that's being generated by your technology stack, and I look at the HTML that's being generated by, and I'm going to ask about two others, HTML export and Transmogrify. And let me just understand from Andy, Transmogrify and HTML export, are those different technology stacks or are they the same?
They're different.
But similar.
Like to see them be the same in the future. If
well, we need to converge. That's kind of what we're talking about.
So maybe we should.
Transmogrify has more hooks for the people trying to customize it. That's the main difference.
Okay, but maybe we shouldn't be looking at either of those, and maybe we should be looking at using Jan's technology stack and basically having it be able to generate. So the main criticism of that. Okay, the big advantage of Jan's technology stack is there's just sort of a slider you can move that determines just how active and how dependent on sort of external cloud assets and so on. In other words, should the manipulates run? If yes, you've got no choice but to actually go interact with the cloud. If no, you can turn them into bitmaps. But in Yarn's technology stack, as I understand it, that's just kind of a knob you can turn. Whereas in these other technology stacks, like exporting raw HTML export, you're just out of luck. If there's a manipulate there, it's got to be bitmapped. Is that
well,
true?
I mean, there can certainly down the road for exporting things with dynamic elements, there can certainly be a place where the two technologies converge.
No, I know, but I think I would love to throw away, I'd love to get rid of a second HTML export technology.
I agree with that, but just to be clear, that we did make it possible to do HTML export with manipulates as embedded objects that were supported by player when it supported, embedding. But we have to undo that again.
Right, but so in principle, they could use Yarn's modern embedded notebook embedder, right? They could.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that would be an alternate pathway. Would be to use the HTML export system with that notebook embedder. Okay, so let's go back again.
Well, just one more comment, but a huge win for going with Jan's direction is that we already are going to be updating the cloud constantly with new features come along.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
But so the question is, what's the downside? And what Jan is saying is, with his technology stack, he could generate a static HTML page. Is that correct, Jan? A complete static HTML page.
Yeah, that's correct. And I was already considering, just having a standalone JavaScript binary or library, basically, that would produce local files for you, if that's what you want. Don't think it would be.
Explain that. I don't understand that. I don't understand that comment. You're saying to run in Electron or something, or to run in some Node.js or something like that? No.
Yeah, you would just execute it via Node.js, for instance. But the main point being that it wouldn't generate assets in the cloud for, say, graphics, but produce local files instead.
Okay, so wait a minute. So what you're saying there is your technology stack could produce a modern version of what HTML export does. Is that true? Which is basically a directory of stuff that you could point that if you put it in a file on your local machine, you could point your web browser at it and it would sing and dance. Is that right?
Yeah, with a bit of work, we could hook it up that way. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now walk me through the downside of this. So HTML export is purely code that can run on any local machine. Do you have a version of that?
Let me think. So it would certainly be some JavaScript code.
Right, so it would be running in Node.js on a local machine.
Yes. And then there are still some things that need the cloud backend. I'll need to think about that, how critical that is.
Those things, but I think the assertion would be that those things, you're out of luck with those things with the traditional HTML export. Right? That anything assertion, which may not be true, that anything where your system actually needs a cloud to be present, you simply couldn't do with the old HTML export.
At runtime, for sure. But I'm thinking even at HTML generation time. The way our system works is it's the JavaScript piece that usually runs in a browser. We run in Node.js, but then there is still the cloud server aspect, which is a bunch of Java code that basically acts as a man in the middle between JavaScript and the kernel. And I have to think about how significant that is. For some things, we could really make it work, but there might be some things that don't work without the Java part.
Okay, so one path here. Okay, so then let's walk through Transmogrify as it now is, which is Transmogrify is, if I'm understanding correctly, the fancier but not end-user usable version of HTML export. Is that a fair statement? A different code base, but that's its
specifically targeted to notebooks and cell expressions.
Right.
The
using version 4 plus technology. It hasn't been really updated for that many years. Yeah.
how old is it?
It was written for version. It was written using version 4.
So that's like 1996, 7. Okay, it's 20 years old. Amazing. Okay. Well, all right. So
it needs to be replaced.
Yeah, but the other thing that you're saying about it is it has many hooks to customize the HTML that it's generating.
Yes.
And those hooks are, so how easy would it be, Jan, to put special hooks into your HTML generator?
If you're thinking about, adding CSS class names and having custom definitions for them, that would not work well for, at least in general. For instance, if you want to change the font size of something, that would affect the layout. But then, in our rendering of the notebook, we usually rely on an absolute position of everything, so things wouldn't adjust to some custom CSS definition.
So the transformative nature of it just wouldn't be there. You would have to create your notebook to look like what you want it to be as HTML, right?
That would certainly be one option. Yeah.
Is that realistic for us? I mean, that would require
I kind of don't think so. Yeah, there are still many things that we get from HTML that we don't get in notebooks right now.
And that we don't necessarily even want in notebooks. They're just the things that people want on the web, but they don't care.
Right.
All right. Well, that's a downer there. So okay.
Right.
So that,
I mean, right now, if you took the same notebook and put it through the reference Transmogrify, it would be different than the resource system Transmogrify. We already have different tools,
I think the whole business of WebItem was to do responsive website, because in the end, the front end is very good at doing something that is absolute positioned, but we don't really have anything in the notebook that scales with the notebook size, and this is what
its structure. Yeah.
And so like WebItem was good because you can resize the window and
okay, but so explain to me, Andy and others, the Transmogrify output is responsive, right? Because we've got a whole responsive system for doing documentation output and so on, right?
Well, it's just because you convert it to HTML that is written
to be responsive.
To be responsive, yeah.
Right, but that HTML is the target of the Transmogrify rules must have been changed to allow responsiveness. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let me look at some of these comments on our live stream here. So D8 says 2 audiences: one who wants to embed notebooks in a simple standard way, and the other is web developers who take processed data and turn it into a custom web page. Yeah, I kind of agree.
There is also like one other big discussion we were having at the time we were designing this whole framework, which is how do you do like dynamic content, and there was idea to use like dynamic module and compile it somehow so that you end up with something that is reactive. The whole reactive idea that is behind React, Vue, and stuff like this, something that is very similar to dynamic that we have in the language for I don't know how many years now. But we don't have a way to translate that into use dynamic to basically generate a web page. And we were trying to.
So let's think about minimal case of that. Okay, so the minimal case will be a dynamic of now, for example, to put a clock there. So I don't know enough about how React and so on works. Is it possible to translate our dynamic of now into some funky React thing? Jan?
I mean, you could certainly implement that in JavaScript, obviously. To translate it in some general way, that's much trickier. I mean, we're talking about compiling Wolfram Language to JavaScript, right? And then
well, no, we don't, not necessarily, because it can be calling out to.
You can use a kernel, yes.
Okay, you still want to use a kernel. Okay. Then let's see. Yeah, you would have to replicate some of the things that we implemented in the cloud front end, and that's obviously implemented on desktop in terms of making dynamic evaluations and probably also keeping track of the dependencies, what symbols have been used during the evaluation, and especially in the case where that's a dynamic module variable.
Well, so you're saying the bottom line here is you could imagine being able to extend this WebItem type thing to be able to deal with dynamics and to basically translate our dynamic dependency stuff into some JavaScript dynamic dependency stuff.
Certainly conceivable. Yeah, it's not. It would be a lot of work, I think, but it could work.
Okay. So let's try a different concept here. Okay. You know, what if we imagine that we will have a thing like Transmogrify, whose function is that it just takes, just like we have notebook import, for instance, which, just takes a notebook and treats it as a symbolic expression and does things with it. What if, is that a useful operation? It could be a useful operation to just have something which takes a notebook and turns it into, with a whole collection of rules, sort of its closest approximating, embeddable HTML plus JavaScript thing.
Yeah, the reason that's a useful thing in my mind is that if I want to put something on WordPress, I don't believe what Jan's output produces would be accepted by WordPress.
Well, that's a different thing, whether WordPress can embed this. But look, what Jan is doing is to make a notebook that is a fully activatable thing that can have computations done in it and so on. Whereas what Transmogrify is doing in a first approximation is it's for viewing only, like most HTML.
Right.
And it is convenient probably for viewing only to make certain transformations. Now, and I can't believe that in modern times that, Transmogrify probably has lots of horrifying rules in it, but the framework of, what we would end up with then is something like, notebook transform or something that takes a notebook here and a set of rules. And what does it output? Well, it could output
XML document.
What's that?
An XML object.
I would think it's more like an HTML. It could be a web item that it outputs.
I think I'd like to see HTML elements.
Well,
come out of Transmogrify.
Even without the rules, it could give you an XML object, which you could then anybody could figure out how to apply transformations on.
Well, you're saying there will be default rules that would be some kind of thing. I don't think it wants to be that low level. I think it wants to be as high level as possible. The thing it outputs by default should be as high level as possible.
Sure.
Really what you're saying, though, is that this is a specific thing to the web. This is kind of notebook to web. Right? That's right. What you're talking about there. And I don't even know. I have no idea. How do the links work in a Transmogrify page? Do you understand what I'm asking? If I have a whole directory like we do in documentation, I have a whole directory of notebooks, and I want to create what are ultimately deployed URLs, links. How does that work?
They're based.
I guess there are rules to convert hyperlink of ref something to.
Yeah, is that right?
They're local.
So again,
yeah, they're local.
No. But what do you mean they're local? They're not local when they're deployed on the web.
Well, they don't have absolute
path names.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do it all relative, and then as long as everything's deployed in unison, it'll work. Or if you know where you're going, you can do them all absolute.
Well, but if you're doing them absolute, there's got to be some rules, because the absolute ones just wouldn't work.
Right, but like we said, there's infinitely many hooks you can do to customize these things.
Okay. Okay, so I mean, yeah. Okay, let me just read through some of these other comments here. Yeah. Ethan is saying, try evaluate all cells in this cloud notebook. Okay, and he predicts that it's going to be absolutely horrifying. Okay, let's try it. Something's happening there. Okay. Kernel will most likely die, he says, silently. And then if you try and re-render the notebook, and then try to re-render the notebook, why did it leave those out? See that?
Not entirely sure, but that definitely used to be a bug where it would use the wrong order. But I think that should be fixed in 149.
Are those not strictly input cells because they have a different style sheet coming from DocuTools?
Well, it must be. It must be. Look, it must have. It must be the right thing, because it got the right output here.
They're just inputs. I don't think we are playing any games with those.
Oh, look at this. This is now working. So that didn't work in the cache, but it does work here. Making sense?
Well, not in the cache. I think you were already seeing the live version.
Well, I understand, but it didn't work before. Oh, I see. On reevaluation, it worked.
Yeah.
What is that? That is a bug. Hello, everybody. That's a bug. Somebody should report that. Is there?
That might be a version 12 thing.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. There's a version 12 page, and that is in fact correct for version 12. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I would say this is not doing too shabbily so far, except for the weirdness of except for this weirdness with these ins not coming out correctly. But okay, so the prediction of Ethan there on the live stream, we'll yet see. We're only halfway through. He may still be correct, but it's going pretty well here.
Next, he's going to dare you to see how many chicken nuggets you can eat in an hour or something.
Right. Okay. They're saying you should probably use a virtual DOM.
Maybe that was in relation to the scrolling, what we talked about.
I think that's when that came in, yeah.
Okay, so someone here is complaining also. Gosh, I'm trying to use people's first names, but it's really impossible when it's a jumble of letters here. SP is saying that I bet if I copy pasted the notebook instead of publishing the cells would not run. If we copy pasted a large lump of cells here, so has that been dealt with, Jan? Of copy pasting from the desktop to a multicellular.
That direction, unfortunately, no. It's trickier than it might seem, and John Foltz can speak about that probably. But there's some risk in, we would have to populate the HTML clipboard, and will certainly work for the cloud, but then other applications might do something unexpected.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. We can only do it by putting it on the HTML clipboard, which then everybody will know about, which means we have to get the HTML clipboard not just correct for the cloud, but correct for anybody who wants to look at the HTML clipboard.
I see.
Which means we have to have a really good HTML export.
Right, but that HTML export has to be two-way. It has to be reconstructible from that.
Well, being able to reconstruct the cloud is no problem because we could just include the full notebook expression yes, in the metadata. But the problem is that, I mean, if we did that and only that, then somebody like maybe like Microsoft Word or something would say, oh, you have an HTML clipboard. Well, I'll paste that.
Yeah.
I don't actually know if Microsoft Word does that, but there are programs out there that will do that. So
right. So we have to decide. We have to be clear what's going to be on there, and in fact, people might actually be happier to not see the HTML.
Yeah.
And there is some hope, though. I mean, browser vendors are working on better APIs for the clipboard, and so at some point we might be able to.
Can we detect that there's a problem, John? I mean, in other words, when we are about to, or Jan, when we're about to paste this thing that came from a multicellular sort of copy in the desktop, and then you try and paste it into the cloud, what does it actually do?
It will, be whatever you would get when pasting into a plain text editor. Will be a bunch of lines.
So the best that we can do is apply heuristics to the plain text.
By the way, why is this not?
And there are heuristics.
Hold on. Something went wrong. I hope it might have been exactly what Ethan said, that the something went wrong here. Look, well, this is no longer.
At some point, the kernel did die. Apparently, yeah.
I just didn't tell us. I don't know what state we're in now. I mean.
Well, all your in and out prompts are unnumbered, so that confirms the kernel died.
Yes, I understand. But I don't think it produced anything too terrible here, so far as I understand it. I mean, there's nothing, unless this is now not going to work. Why would this not be working? That should not be a particularly slow thing. Is this now totally hosed? No, seems to be working fine there. I see, it just took a little while. Okay. So I'm not sure, I mean, yes, the kernel died, although we were probably asking it to do a lot. It would have been nice, I mean, it might have been nice to have some indication that had happened. Jan.
Mm-hmm.
Some notifier or something. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, it doesn't look like it did any particular harm here. Okay. Now another note here. One shout out to a local deploy option for API functions. Yes. Okay, best way to allow. Okay, so this relates to this comment from Durbo. This relates to things we've been discussing about Web Engine and so on, asking for a asking, I think, for a local deploy that allows you on your machine to have something which serves APIs. That is exactly what Web Engine and our application server direction are about. Best way to allow an option to let local deploy behind an Nginx or general purpose server like Caddy. I've not heard of Caddy. I've heard of Nginx. Well, I think that's for a different set of people to discuss, unless Jan wants to make, or anybody else wants to make a comment on that. I think the answer is we are very much going in this direction, and I believe we will be providing what you're asking for, I hope. Oh, I see. Oh, but you're asking, let me think about this. Well, local notebooks accessing local APIs. Wow. That's even a different case. Because, let me just understand something. With one of the things you were previously saying, okay, Jan, can you imagine having No, you can't have, without the whole cloud infrastructure, you can't have a locally presented web browser readable cloud notebook. Cloud notebook that isn't in the cloud. Did that make any sense?
You could, I mean, similar to HTML export, you could generate the HTML once and take care of serving all the image files and style sheets and so on, and then you would have a static view of the notebook. But once you want
what about the
interactivity?
Right, but so I think what's being asked here in this question is, in that case, could one have the interactivity call a local server like the Wolfram application server or web engine rather than calling the cloud?
It won't immediately work. It's something we can think about, but for many things we need that Java layer in between right now, which basically is the cloud.
Right. Right. Okay.
For some simple things, it probably wouldn't even be too hard to make JavaScript call the kernel directly, or maybe through some very lightweight thing in the middle. But there are many edge cases where it really needs the Java code right now.
Right. Okay. So another comment: the notebook embedder would be nice if it had a read-only mode. I think the notebook embedder, unfortunately, is a read-only thing. Is that not correct?
It doesn't support editing or evaluation of whole cells, but it does support interactivity of, let's say, manipulate. And you can choose whether you want to enable that or not.
And how do you choose that?
Well, two things. You need to enable interactivity on the notebook itself by giving permission. So you would say, all goes to read and interact. And then you can also choose on the JavaScript client side, when you use the library in your JavaScript code, you can say whether you actually want to enable interactivity or not.
Okay. All right. Let's try and come to some conclusions here. Okay. So I think first thing is the sort of symbolic description of HTML. So we've got these different levels of description. We've got plain text of the HTML plus inclusions. We've got this opaque DOM objects. We've got the symbolic HTML tree, and we've got the WebItem-like elements. So the obvious right answer here is that that we should support all of these things in an interoperable way. Does that make sense to people? So that, for example, the WebItem thing could contain these lower level objects. Is that sensible, or is that impossible?
I think that depends on which approach to WebItem you mean.
No, I'm talking about Ricardo's WebItem.
In a way, it's already implemented like this. I mean, you can nest like WebItem with XML and use them inside XML template, or the other way around, I think.
Okay. So, but is there a sense in which, I mean, the HTML, you could end up with a forced to be top level piece of HTML, but if you do that and you put that inside, then it's not going to work, and that's your problem. But I mean, it seems like supporting something which allows you to specify, low-level HTML either in one of these three ways, either as the plain text of the HTML, some kind of symbolic HTML element, or something that I don't know how do you write out this is a naive question. The HTML DOM, how does it serialize? Or is the serialization an HTML page? What is the serialization of an HTML DOM? Jan or somebody, can you answer that?
I mean, basically something very much like HTML. There are some technicalities where it might make a difference. Like, I mean, when we talk about the DOM, it's really the live document and the representation of that. So, for instance, you would see event handlers in a DOM, but not in the serialized HTML.
What? Wait a minute. Wait a second. So the question is, when one is reading, like that nice GitHub thing that was reading HTML, I'm now confused. That was, okay, so we believe that that could be reading symbolic HTML elements, but that might not be efficient or some such other thing. Or do we believe that it has to be reading something which still has handles to a DOM?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the library.
Okay. But in any case, so, you know, the thing we're talking about here would be finishing what Ricardo has with the ability to put, instead of his, so Ricardo, do you have a mechanism to put raw HTML inside your web page specifications?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what's the difference then between what we're looking at, between what you have here, which I did think the design was largely finished. I'm sorry, remind me, Eric, you said you didn't look at Ricardo's stuff, is that right?
We did start taking a look at it, but we didn't quite understand everything that was going on in it. But we haven't had a chance to really dive.
Okay, so what I think we should do is your proto design seems pretty thin to me. It's just a symbolic representation of the tree structure of HTML. Is that not correct?
Well, it's kind of like that, but also trying to illustrate, the discussions that I had with Brad was how, especially revolve around kind of WPI's work of creating very customized web pages that we can then pass off to content writers to be able to, use Wolfram Language to put in all the content. So basically, WPI would build all these web items that then any content developer can just plop in and then run the notebook, and then suddenly they have a web page that they can look at.
I don't understand that. That's basically saying that there has to be a repository of web templates.
Right. It's kind of a third case that wasn't really discussed earlier, where Wolfram Language is used to generate content and as the build process for a page or a site.
So sorry, what? Because you said that again, I got distracted.
Where the Wolfram language is used as kind of the build process, where you've got your web developers and Eric's group that put together this structure, in terms they're familiar with, and then can pass it off to other teams for content or things like that.
Okay,
and then
so
we have Wolfram language build.
I don't understand. All you're talking about there is, in our hierarchy here, we're looking at. Sorry, where was it? Yeah, you were just looking at this. We're just saying have a repository of useful HTML templates that are written in essentially in HTML/XML with our XML template inclusion representation, right? That's what you're talking about there. You want people to be able to write big blobs of fancy HTML plus JavaScript plus CSS, whatever code, that is templatable. Is that correct? I think so. Yeah, okay. So fine. So this is irrelevant to that, because all you want is they've got HTML code and they can insert and you can take sort of Wolfram language content and insert it in that HTML template, right? But there's no reason for the HTML template to have this structured symbolic form. It could do, but it doesn't need to have that form. Can somebody else help me? Am I misunderstanding something, or do I have it correct?
Well, in a way, we could go the path where WPI would write, just files that could be
files that contain.
But it was also kind of making it easier so that non-developers could also look at it and understand what's going on.
I don't understand what problem you're solving there. So I mean, if you're solving the problem, look, what would happen? Oh, that's not what I wanted at all. I'm typing into completely the wrong thing. I am looking for this. Okay, so you see these kinds of tags here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm imagining is that your, down in the trenches HTML developer is writing HTML with those tags in it. That HTML becomes a template stored in a repository that can then be trotted out as something that is either inside or outside Ricardo's stuff. Am I making sense? Because what's ultimately going to happen is that thing's going to be run just using template apply with certain content that's being inserted in place of those tags. Is that correct?
Right.
Anybody else? And so I don't understand what the choice of whether to use a symbolic representation of that XML of that HTML or a purely textual one seems completely orthogonal to this question of what the workflow is. Is that not correct? Somebody else?
I think the symbolic, the benefit of the symbolic thing would be you could import it to the symbolic, expression and make modifications.
You can manipulate it, right? I mean,
yeah, but you can. Okay, we're dealing with two things here. You can manipulate the raw HTML in an editor.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so there's some purposes for which it's a lot easier to do that. Yes. If you're just tweaking trivial things in the HTML. If you want to do something programmatically, it might well be easier to do it in symbolic form.
Right.
So now what we need is going between those two things. We need an importer and an exporter. So we discussed the question of HTML import, which apparently is inadequate. And one of the things that we could then do is import the HTML to this symbolic form. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
And then if you want to, you can manipulate it in the symbolic form. Then you could export it again. You'll get the textual form. And that will be that piece of the workflow. Does that make sense to people?
Yep.
And presumably, in the symbolic form of the HTML, you would be able to have template elements that would then get exported as those template tags. Does that make sense? Should I say that again?
No, I understand. It makes sense to me. I mean, that would be a goal, yes.
Right. And in symbolic form, those are things like template slot, right? So in other words, what we're saying is, if you import a piece of, let's call it enhanced HTML, Wolfram enhanced HTML, Wolfram language tagged HTML. Okay, you understand, Eric and Brad, you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, Eric? Well, it's symbolic HTML.
No. I'm saying, look, the case there is we're taking what we're taking is, let's say, Wolfram tagged textual HTML. Okay, do you understand what I mean? Eric, you understand what I mean by that?
That already has some Wolfram placeholders in it. You're saying.
That has these kinds of. Eric, do you understand what I mean by that?
Yep.
Okay, so I mean that it contains stuff like that, right? But it's otherwise textual HTML, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Isn't the T in HTML text?
I'm sorry?
I'm just.
You're joking.
The acronym has text in it twice.
I'm well aware.
Okay.
So it's like
ATM machine.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. I'm often looking for an example of that.
Right.
That's a good one. Okay. Okay. So that's one case, is Wolfram tag textual HTML. Okay. Another thing is WL symbolic HTML. So that is the thing that you were talking about with HTML elements and all those kinds of things. Does that make sense? And within symbolic HTML, there would be things like template slot. In other words, the translation of this stuff would be to template slot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Eric, you understand?
Yep.
Okay. So then those are two representations of raw HTML. And then the next level of stuff is we've got, Ricardo's WebItem. which is beyond just symbolic HTML. It defines more sophisticated things symbolically for web pages. Make sense? And it can contain either of these other things. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so these are these things here are the content representations. Okay. Okay, then we've got the actions. Let's see. Okay. The actions will be, let me see. What are the actions? So the actions are, okay, so one action is resolve the templating, aka run template apply. Okay, and then the output of the resolving of the templating. So output is a pure HTML file, I believe.
No, it'd just be a snippet. It could be a snippet of HTML.
Yeah, or it could probably be multiple files. Or fragment or multiple files. I don't quite understand how that works, but okay. Yeah, by the way, there's another piece to this, which is directories of the above. Right, because it might not be a single file that you want. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so resolving the templating is one thing. So another thing, so then there's actually, oh boy. Another flow would be go from a raw notebook, a pure notebook, to some web assets. Okay, that's another thing we want to do. Yes?
Yes.
And there are two ways to do that. Number one, faithful rendering, which is basically cloud technology. And the other is transformed rendering, which is basically Transmogrify, or some version of that. And we believe those are two separate things that you might want. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and where you say directories, is that implying a site representation of a site, or is that another thing yet?
Maybe. Okay. So, okay. So what else do we need here? So that there's also things like, so in the WebItem, there can be notebooks, form functions, etc. embedded, right? So those web assets, okay, the web assets may need, okay, so then the next thing is execution environments or deployment environments.
Is importing another action?
Yes, yeah. Yes. Import from HTML to symbolic form. Okay, so deployment. So the deployments of this. Okay, so one deployment is a file/directory of pure HTML. Well, pure HTML plus etc. And this might need a local Node.js to run the JavaScript. Does that right? Or it might just be a pure, or it might be pure HTML. So that's one output.
What it generates is pure HTML. To generate it, if we use the cloud technology, you would certainly need JavaScript.
I see.
Or you would call the cloud. That's also an option.
Right, you could run it through the cloud and get back pure HTML.
Okay, so faithful rendering either happening through the cloud or perhaps through local Node.js.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, and the transformed rendering will be pure WL code. That won't need any other stuff because that's just going to be lumps of, it's just going to be told this is the, okay, so the deployment. So first thing is a file directory of pure HTML, right? Which is then runnable, that can be, ingestible by any browser. I wonder whether ingestible has another, oh yes, no, I thought that was the right spelling. I don't know. Can somebody find out if it's a word, and if it is, put it in the spelling dictionary? Who's project managing here?
Andrea.
Can you look that up, please? Ingestible by any web browser.
It is indeed a word.
Okay. Is it a Scrabble word, John?
Yes, it is a Scrabble word.
Okay. Let's put it in the dictionary. Okay. Okay. So that's one output, right? Another output is a cloud notebook living in the cloud. Yes. That's another thing that can be output by these various, transformations. Or
if you want a notebook, then you don't need any transformation. At least if you start with a notebook.
Well, you're right. That doesn't make any sense. Sorry, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, now what about where is Ricardo's thing being served from? Okay, so this I think is another thing, a servable web page. Wow, we're getting a lot of words. Web page in the cloud. So Ricardo's thing was being served on some totally weird domain. Is that not correct, Ricardo?
File domain. It's on your local machine, you just open it.
Okay, but so you are currently falling into that output, right? The file or directory of HTML. Is that correct?
It's a static, it's a static compilation process. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm just trying to understand what it is that we want to have happen here. So this thing, you're making a directory of static assets. Is that correct, Ricardo?
Sure. I think also Transmogrify is doing something similar, right? Yeah, it's completely static. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's true for all of these flows.
Okay. All right. But that can call APIs or embeddings in the cloud sometimes, right? It might need to do that, or it might not.
I can see a future where Transmogrify.
No. I'm just asking about what you've got right now, right? What Ricardo has, it might need to call. It's obviously pulling in URLs, external URLs, and it could also pull in something which is an embedded notebook. Is that correct, Ricardo?
Yes. I mean, this part of design was solving a particular problem, which is the CSS, the visualization of the HTML. How you do interaction, it's completely other, design issue.
Well, okay. Then the other thing we might want is to be able to take what you have, Ricardo, WebItem, and cloud deploy WebItem. right? You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And is there any problem with doing that?
No, I mean,
okay, but then this would then
delayed
be
or an API or anything that
no. But I understand. But what I'm asking is, your thing that right now is being served out of a file on your local machine. There's no reason you can't just say put that on the web, right?
Sure.
And then
or
your bundle of files.
Yeah, sure.
Right,
you can deploy it everywhere you want.
No, I understand, but there's a piece of plumbing that's not completely trivial, which is when you do that deployment, this web item has to unfurl itself in the cloud. And it may unfurl itself to multiple files, for example. Am I making sense? When you do this, when you render this, your function called test that was rendering this, okay? It is writing a directory of stuff.
That is a single page, a single view. Yes, if you have like an hierarchy of.
Right.
That's again another directory.
Right, it's writing a directory. So what I'm saying is cloud deploy has to be able to write a directory into the cloud, which is then exposed through URLs in the cloud, right?
We have URL dispatcher for that, which is dynamic, and there was like
yes, okay.
I don't remember the name that was static, the equivalent of URL dispatcher.
External bundle.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, fine. So you're deploying an external bundle.
This is assuming that there's not a template needing arguments.
Well, if it's a template, then you're deploying an API.
Right. That's a whole other case.
Well, okay, but then, okay, so look, an API that returns a servable web page. Right, so that would then look like a cloud deploy of API function of essentially WebItem. Is that correct? Ricardo, is that correct?
Something similar on the second argument, yes. Mm-hmm.
Right, so what that would allow you to do is dynamically create a website with parameters that you will then see.
Right. That allows to generate this thing dynamically, but of course, like if you run export on it.
This is generating the thing dynamically.
Mm-hmm. I hope it doesn't need a directory then. It can all be inlined.
I have no idea.
Yes.
I mean,
which is why I would say you need the directory if you are creating several pages and API function.
This might generate several pages, so you got to have a way to deal with it.
If it is several pages, then it's URL dispatcher, and then like on the right hand side of the URL dispatcher, you put an API function, and then on the second argument of API function, you put like this layout thing.
All right. So listen, I think we've got the elements of a plan here. Okay. I'm not sure who's exactly going to take the lead on this stuff. I think we need to understand this GitHub thing with HTML import. We need to understand how those HTML elements relate to any of the other ones. I wasn't particularly excited about Eric's design. I mean, it's nice to see that group starting to do these designs, and I perhaps shouldn't be not be as negative about it. I just would have appreciated it if you guys had actually looked at the other stuff before you showed me that design. It would be good to try and see what will be a minimal Transmogrify design, or a more. I've never even seen, probably not for 20 years, the design of Transmogrify. Right. So let's think about Andy. Andre,
syntax and examples.
Right. I mean,
yes.
And that might play into the project that Jay's starting on as well.
Which is what?
Documentation writing system.
No.
Okay.
No, that's
historically the authoring side has always been completely separate from the conversion side, and will remain so. That's not changed.
Okay. That's a whole other discussion. Yeah, let's not get into that.
Right. Okay. So here, Okay, so I'd like to see some sort of presentation of what is there now and what we could build in the future. And obviously, one thing we want to be able to do is to transport over the giant Transmogrify rule towers, let's call them, that are used for our actual documentation, so that any modern version of Transmogrify, we could just use those without having to find for the next God knows how many years, finding little detailed things that weren't moved over correctly. Am I making sense? Andy, you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I understand.
Are you saying that's totally unrealistic to yourself?
Well, I think we're both taking breaths.
Okay.
Just because of the years that have gone into this stuff, but yes.
Well, I know, but I'm saying use all that. Use all that.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah. Don't try and think we're going to rebuild it, because we're not. This would just be an outer layer that can potentially take this big blob of complicated rules and use them, but has a cleaner outer layer. Okay. And then meanwhile, Yarn has got to figure out how to generate from, in this one, the faithful rendering version, how to generate a complete HTML page from that. And that's probably the future of HTML export. Am I making sense?
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, what
okay,
you generate is a complete...
about. No. If you're rendering in the cloud, I'm talking about the cache being a complete HTML cache.
Okay, yep, that we can do.
Right, so that's another piece to this, right? Because that's the piece that we need in order to make an HTML export that just runs through the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which might be localizable as well.
But that's less of a priority, or...
I think so. Well, I don't know. I think it's less of a priority. I think it would be okay to run that through the cloud.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
As long as the result you get back works independently of the cloud.
So you still want to get a directory that has all the assets.
Yes.
And potentially.
Right. But the cloud's a service to get that to you.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good approach.
Right. And it may have trailing pieces that actually require the cloud. Like the manipulate may not run unless you have it connected to the cloud, and those kinds of things. So it will try to provide you localizable assets as much as it can, but some of them may trail and be left in the cloud. Is that correct?
I mean, the HTML cache in itself will not try to run and manipulate at all. There's basically no JavaScript involved.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying in the end you're getting this thing that is a rendering of a notebook in HTML. Okay? If the notebook has a manipulate in it, what is going to be in the HTML?
A display of the manipulate.
Okay, but could it not be an embedded notebook, an embedded cloud notebook of the manipulate?
It could be. I mean, it's not how it works now, so we have to make some changes. I need to think about how.
Right, but that's right. But so I'm saying that would be a super cache, so to speak. Right. So there are different versions here. You know, this could either be HTML from the cloud that has only local elements, localized elements, so local elements, or could have embeddings that point back to the cloud. Make sense? And that's analogous in HTML export. I believe we have some options. Well, we used to have those options to do with being able to have plugins. I mean, that's the analog of the old plugin options.
Right.
Right. So in other words, either you just get a bitmap or you get something which points through a quotes plugin, except that this is now an embedded cloud view to the cloud. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have a couple of more comments on the live stream here. If you're using an XML template, you don't have a directory of templates. You have one template and a big list of data, which creates a directory of output. Don't understand that. I thought an XML template would just give you one. Oh, I see. You want to run the XML template across, like doing a file system scan, for example, across a bunch of things. Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with that. Okay. All right. I actually think we have unscrambled a lot of things here. All right. So we are going to need to finish Ricardo's stuff, as I've said multiple times. It looks like it's in pretty good shape already. There are going to be a bunch of corner cases about embedding. We have still not completely solved the 3 forms on a page problem. Right, Ricardo?
To some extent, yes. Probably there are multiple solutions to this problem. But yeah.
Okay, but we need a solution. Okay, but I think we've got some, path forward here. Now, I mean, just to be clear, none of what we're describing here has any way of solving the panels and the desktop problem. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, we started with a uniform design that was going from notebook to the web, but then we realized that the web got its own language that is completely different, unfortunately, from
right.
the one.
And none of these things using Electron or any of these other technologies would allow us to do this because of sandboxing between browser worlds and executables. Is that correct? That's a question for John Fultz and so on.
That is correct. Yeah.
So of all
the only way you could work around that is by running an insecure web server, which is not something that I would recommend.
Hold on, let's just walk through that for 1 second. Imagine that you had a local web server running, okay, that was insecure in the sense that its web pages could call out to a binary.
Yeah.
Could that work?
Which is to say that you would have to modify the web server itself to do that.
Well, but I mean, when you say web server, you make it sound very fancy. I mean, the minimal web server is a tiny piece of code. This doesn't have to be, remember, all the technology is in the browser. That's where all the fancy rendering and so on is taking place. What you're saying is, let's just walk through this for 1 second. So start local web server, right? We've already got that technology. And I don't know what that server is. That server is some totally minimal server, right? Is that correct?
Is that the Go thing?
I think it might be. Ricardo, can you speak to that?
Is not exposing system, and the implementation was unfortunately not super stable, so we never released it.
I understand.
Production.
I'm asking.
We have new implementations now, and yeah.
What's that?
What are you asking now? Sorry.
I'm asking. Okay.
Start web server, so it's not a symbol in system context.
Okay. All right. Fine. Can I actually run it or not?
You need to get a packet that is called HTTP endlink backtick, and
okay,
then
hold on a second. Desktop
that is working.
Desktop panel language. Okay, hold on. So actually, John, I think this sounds extremely promising. Okay, so let's walk through this idea for 1 second. Okay, imagine we go from start web server, right? And imagine that web server, which is a very minimal web server. I mean, the thing that was written in Go is some tiny little piece of code, right? And we have a custom web server, which is, as you say, insecure. That is, a pure quotes web page can access, our whole computation system.
Can delete files on your system.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can literally.
Yes, it can delete files. Literally. It can do anything it wants.
Yeah.
Just like if you have a raw notebook open, it can do anything it wants, right? Within a raw notebook, I could say delete file star, whatever, right? This is a raw notebook. This is for individual users doing things. This is not intended to be deployment. This is saying, you've opened a notebook, you can do whatever you want. The only difference here is that the notebook you've opened has some web assets around it. So my question would be, in that scenario, okay, I'm still confused here, what you can do and what you can't do. So we couldn't serve a cloud notebook. Is that true? Because that's a whole pile of other technology to do that.
That's basically an EPC.
Right. Okay, so just to understand, if you had an EPC,
if an EPC were a thing that you could just install onto your local computer and run it without too much effort and too much resource usage,
then then you would have to have a hacked web server for the EPC, and then what you could do is run.
I mean, of course, you could do this. Without a hacked web server, you would just be living inside the sandbox the EPC defines for you, which does give you a file system, but it doesn't necessarily give you your file system.
Okay, so look, this is in a sense a null statement, because what it's basically saying is an EPC is providing the whole cloud environment.
Yeah.
In the cloud environment, you can do all these things.
Yeah.
That what we're trying to get is something where you can have paneling, so to speak, around a traditional desktop notebook.
Right. And
maybe that's just hopeless.
It's plug-in territory, basically.
And there's no way, even if you control the web server and you decide we're perfectly happy to have plugins because it's just a single user doing their thing, is there any way to do it other than just absurd hackery?
I think we're into absurd hackery. Could you create some kind of web server side plugin that tries to kind of act like a browser plugin did? Maybe. It would be probably very slow and probably have all kinds of problems with it.
Yeah, the rendering cannot be through the web browser. The rendering has to be through the native desktop notebook. So
and the way the Mac browser front end worked was literally by pushing bitmaps back and forth. But in that case, it was pushing bitmaps back and forth over MathLink.
To what?
So the actual browser plugin was basically nothing. It was two things. One was it was a thing which knew how to display bitmaps and communicate or receive those bitmaps from a genuine front end. And two, it was a thing which knew how to relay events like keyboard events, mouse events, that kind of thing, to the front end.
That's just total hackery. I mean, that's like running VNC or something.
and yet you used it for a number of years. But that was what we had to do.
Okay, so why is that not repeatable? In other words, that particular model, insane though it is, of essentially running VNC from inside your browser.
Well, an actual VNC requires a machine that you're displaying.
I didn't mean that exactly, but I mean something with that kind of protocol.
In
fact, let me ask this question. Within a browser, is it not the case that you can do things like Zoom and screen sharing applications in general? Don't they use some protocol which I now forget? Web, what is it? is it WebApp? No, what is the protocol that's used?
I don't know the protocol, but I know the idea that you're talking about, though.
Right, but within I mean, clearly.
So, I mean, these things, yeah, I mean, basically what you would have to do is you would have to have a virtual desktop that, you know, that can be mirrored in some way. And that would be a pretty non-trivial, and then mirrored, you know, through a web server. And that, you know, that would be a pretty non-trivial piece of technology.
Right. Well, it sounds like
so. You know, VNC and Zoom and those kinds of things. You know, they have the benefit of, you know, that they're at least working with an existing desktop.
Yeah, I understand. So, okay, look, clearly these solutions are probably even more complicated than actually building out paneling in the notebook desktop environment.
Yeah, which is what I would much rather be doing.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, so a question then for you, John, is if you look at Ricardo's WebItem design, is it, you know, what's the level of insanity of connecting that? I mean, so some of what we're choosing to do there is very CSS specific.
Right. Well, and the and sorry, I wasn't prepared to answer this question, but there is a library that Facebook has that that you can basically, you know, plug this these CSS type specifications into it and get out a bunch of rectangles. So that you don't have to do all of the layout yourself, where layout is defined as, you know, this equals, you know, how many pixels by how many pixels for,
yeah, well, basically so it's replicating, it's a more modularized version of what CSS does inside.
Yeah, where the layout computations are concerned, yes. And so I'm counting on the fact, although, you know, we've not run any experiments, but I'm counting on the fact that whether it's Facebook's library or somebody else doing something similar, that you know, that there will be, you know, some C compatible library out there that we can use to do this. Now, as far as, you know, the multi-window management, we're just going to do, you know, that's just the hard work we're going to have to do. But the layout, I'm hoping that we won't have to do that from scratch.
So then, if we're going to use a CSS-inspired layout engine anyway, having, you know, working at Ricardo's system with things that fall down into raw CSS doesn't seem that horrifying.
Right.
We should probably wrap it so that if when we have a final, you know, when we have a symbolic abstraction of it, we can use that. But I think we should allow people to just use the raw CSS specifications if they want to.
Yeah. And you know, as you know, I mean, these layout things, you know, they can be difficult to get right because they turn into fixed point problems.
Yep.
So I'm quite happy not to have to rewrite that.
Yeah, and I think also, honestly, if people are used to the CSS way of doing it, even if the CSS has bugs with respect to how it does the fixed point computations, people are at least used to those bugs.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a problem we have to solve. All right. Well, this is great. Then, okay, we're going to need to allocate resources to actually move forward on this, but I think we have a good direction here. And I think I'm convinced that, yeah, we shouldn't try. There's no hackery that's going to work here. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. And thanks to people here. Thank you to folks on the live stream. A lot of really, really useful comments and interaction here. So until the next time, see you all soon.